She was supposed to be the happiest girl in the world that night. White dress flowing like silk in the summer breeze, flowers in her hair, surrounded by everyone she loved. But somewhere between the first dance and midnight, she simply vanished, as if the earth had swallowed her whole. For 14 years, her family searched, police investigated, the media moved on. But the white dress held secrets that would change everything. If you believe that every story deserves to be told, if you believe that the forgotten deserve a voice, subscribe to this channel. It helps us bring light to the darkness that others want to keep buried. This is the story of Emma Richardson, 23 years old, a bride who disappeared on what should have been the most beautiful night of her life. This is the story of how a piece of fabric, hidden in shadows for over a decade, would finally reveal the truth about what happened in those final moments before she vanished forever. The wedding was perfect. Too perfect, some would say later. The kind of perfect that makes you wonder if someone was trying too hard to create the illusion of happiness. But on that warm Saturday evening in June 2009, in the small town of Millbrook, nobody was thinking about illusions. They were thinking about love, about forever, about the young woman who had captured everyone's hearts. Nobody could have imagined that before the sun rose again, Emma Richardson would become a ghost, a memory, a question mark that would haunt an entire community for 14 long years. Emma Richardson was the kind of person who made rooms brighter just by walking into them. At 23, she had the infectious laugh of someone who truly believed the world was full of possibilities. She worked as a kindergarten teacher at Millbrook Elementary, where children would run to hug her legs every morning, and parents trusted her with their most precious gifts. She lived in a small apartment above the town's only bookstore, surrounded by novels she'd read twice and plants she talked to like old friends. Her neighbors would often hear her humming while she watered her flowers on the tiny balcony that overlooked Main Street. She knew everyone's name, remembered birthdays, and had a way of making even the grumpiest residents smile. Emma had been with David Martinez for 3 years. They'd met at a coffee shop where she was grading papers and he was fixing the espresso machine. He was 2 years older, worked as a mechanic at his father's garage, and had the kind of steady, quiet personality that balanced Emma's vibrant energy perfectly. Their relationship was the kind that made other couples envious, genuine, supportive, filled with inside jokes and comfortable silences. The engagement had been simple, but perfect. David had proposed during a picnic by the lake where they'd had their first date, with Emma's favorite wildflowers scattered around a blanket her grandmother had made. She'd said yes before he could even finish asking the question, tears streaming down her face as she kissed him under the summer sky. Emma's family adored David. Her mother, Carol, often said he was the son she'd never had. Her father, Robert, appreciated David's work ethic and the way he looked at Emma like she was the most precious thing in the world. Her younger brother, Michael, just 19 and home from college, had grown to see David as the older brother he'd always wanted. But perhaps what made Emma most special was her ability to see the good in everyone. She volunteered at the local animal shelter, organized food drives for struggling families, and had a way of making everyone feel heard and valued. She was the kind of person who remembered that Mrs. Henderson's arthritis was acting up, or that Tommy from her class was having trouble at home. She was planning to expand the family soon. She and David had talked about children, about the house they'd buy, about growing old together in the town they both loved. Emma had already started a hope chest, filling it with baby clothes and toys she'd found at garage sales, dreaming of the family they'd build together. She was beloved, trusted, and completely unprepared for what was waiting for her in the shadows of her own wedding celebration, June 13th, 2009. The evening was perfect, warm but not humid, with a gentle breeze that made the white tent decorations dance like ghosts in the fading light. The wedding had been held at the Millbrook Community Center, a modest venue that Emma had transformed into something magical with fairy lights, wildflowers, and the kind of personal touches that made every guest feel like family. The ceremony had been beautiful. Emma had walked down the aisle in her grandmother's restored wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown that had been carefully preserved for decades. Her veil, handmade by her mother, caught the light as she moved, making her look almost ethereal. David had cried when he saw her, and there wasn't a dry eye in the small crowd of family and friends. The reception was everything Emma had dreamed of. There was dancing, laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from celebrating with people you truly love. Emma moved through the crowd like a butterfly, hugging relatives, dancing with her father, sharing inside jokes with her college roommates who had driven hours to be there. At 9:30 p.m., Emma was seen talking to her maid of honor, Sarah, near the dessert table. They were laughing about something, and Sarah later said Emma seemed perfectly happy and relaxed. She had mentioned wanting to touch up her makeup before the bouquet toss, which was scheduled for 10 p.m. At 9:45 p.m., Emma's cousin spotted her heading toward the community center's side door, the one that led to the parking lot. She was still in her wedding dress, still glowing with happiness. Her cousin waved, and Emma smiled and waved back. It was the last time anyone who loved her would see her alive. The bouquet toss came and went. Emma wasn't there. David looked concerned but not panicked. Maybe she was in the bathroom. Maybe she'd stepped outside for air. The party continued, but a subtle anxiety began to creep through the celebration like smoke. By 10:30 p.m., worry had turned to alarm. David had checked the bathrooms, the parking lot, even the kitchen. Emma's purse was still at the head table, her phone inside, battery full. Her car keys were in David's pocket. They'd planned to leave together in his truck, decorated with cans and flowers by the wedding party. Carol Richardson felt it first, that terrible mother's intuition that something was wrong. She organized the female guests to check every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. The men spread out across the parking lot and the surrounding area, calling Emma's name into the darkness. By 11 p.m., someone had called the police. By midnight, the celebration had transformed into a search party. The fairy lights that had seemed so magical hours earlier now cast eerie shadows as dozens of flashlights swept through the darkness, looking for any sign of the missing bride. Emma's wedding dress had been the centerpiece of the evening. Everyone had complimented how beautiful she looked, how the vintage lace caught the light, how perfect she seemed. But now that dress was gone, and with it the young woman who had worn it with such joy and hope. The night that should have been the beginning of forever had become the end of everything. The transformation was immediate and devastating. One moment, the Richardson family was celebrating the happiest day of their lives. The next, they were living in a nightmare that would never end. Carol Richardson, who had spent months planning every detail of her daughter's wedding, became a woman possessed. She refused to leave the community center, pacing the parking lot and calling Emma's name until her voice became hoarse. She examined every inch of the venue, convinced that her daughter was hiding somewhere, maybe hurt and unable to call for help. Robert Richardson, typically a man of few words, took charge of organizing the search. He coordinated with the arriving police officers, his mechanic's hands steady as he sketched rough maps of the area and divided the volunteers into search teams. But those who knew him could see the terror in his eyes, the way his jaw tightened every time someone asked if Emma might have just left on her own. David Martinez was falling apart. This was supposed to be his wedding night, the beginning of his life with Emma. Instead, he was answering question after question from police officers who seemed to view him with increasing suspicion. Where had he been when Emma disappeared? Had they fought? Was she happy about the marriage? The questions felt like accusations, and David's grief was tinged with a growing desperation to make someone understand that he would never hurt Emma. Michael Richardson, home from college and still adjusting to the idea of his sister as a married woman, threw himself into the search with manic energy. He knew every trail, every hiding spot, every corner of Millbrook from years of childhood adventures with Emma. He searched until dawn, his formal wedding attire torn and dirty, refusing to stop even when the police suggested the family go home and rest. The police response was immediate but limited. Millbrook was a small town with a small police force, and they'd never dealt with anything like this before. Chief Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran who had known Emma since she was a child, treated the case with the urgency it deserved, but resources were limited. They called in support from the county sheriff's office and requested assistance from the state police. As word spread through the small community, an army of volunteers emerged. Neighbors who had attended the wedding stayed to help search. Others who had heard the news arrived with flashlights and determined faces. The local volunteer fire department brought additional equipment and expertise. By 3 a.m., nearly 200 people were combing through the woods and fields surrounding the community center. But as the hours passed with no sign of Emma, a terrible reality began to set in. This wasn't a simple case of a bride who had gotten cold feet. This wasn't a prank or a misunderstanding. Something terrible had happened to Emma Richardson, and it had happened on what should have been the most protected, most celebrated night of her life. The wedding decorations still hung in the community center, now looking mournful rather than festive. The cake sat untouched, the flowers wilted in the summer heat. The celebration had become a crime scene, and the Richardson family's joy had been replaced by a fear that would consume them for years to come. In the days following Emma's disappearance, the tight-knit community of Millbrook began to fracture under the weight of suspicion and fear. People who had been friends for decades started looking at each other differently, and behaviors that might have seemed normal before now took on sinister undertones. David Martinez, the grieving groom, became the first target of whispered speculation. Some townspeople noticed that he'd been unusually calm during the initial search, more organized than emotional. Others remembered that he'd insisted on helping coordinate the search teams rather than just waiting for news. Was this the behavior of a concerned husband, or someone trying to control the narrative? The gossip intensified when people remembered that David had been talking to his ex-girlfriend, Linda Stevens, just weeks before the wedding. Linda had moved back to town after her divorce, and several people had seen her and David having coffee together. When asked about it, David explained that Linda had been having a difficult time and had reached out for support as an old friend. But in the paranoid atmosphere following Emma's disappearance, innocent explanations felt inadequate. Even more disturbing were the stories about Emma's behavior in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Sarah, her maid of honor, reluctantly admitted that Emma had seemed stressed and distracted lately. She'd been having trouble sleeping, had lost weight, and had mentioned feeling like someone was watching her. Sarah had assumed it was just pre-wedding nerves, but now these details felt ominous. Mrs. Henderson, Emma's elderly neighbor, came forward with information that sent chills through the investigation. She'd noticed a dark pickup truck parked across from Emma's apartment several times in the month before the wedding, always at night, always with someone sitting inside. When she'd mentioned it to Emma, the young woman had gone pale and asked her to call the police if she ever saw it again. The truck detail led to uncomfortable questions about Jake Morrison, a local man who had been infatuated with Emma since high school. Jake had never been quite right. He'd dropped out of school, had trouble holding jobs, and had a history of following women around town. Several people remembered seeing him at the wedding, though he hadn't been invited. When police went to question him, his mother claimed he'd been home all evening, but neighbors reported seeing his truck leaving the house around 9 p.m. Even more troubling was the discovery that Emma's classroom at the elementary school had been broken into just 3 days before the wedding. Nothing had been stolen, but her desk had been rifled through, and personal photos were missing. The principal had assumed it was a simple burglary and hadn't thought to mention it until after Emma disappeared. Carol Richardson began to remember strange phone calls in the weeks before the wedding, calls where the caller would hang up when she answered. Emma had received several similar calls, always late at night, always silent. The phone company's records showed the calls had come from different payphones around town, making them impossible to trace. The most unsettling revelation came from Emma's co-worker, Janet Mills, who taught second grade at the elementary school. Janet admitted that Emma had confided in her about feeling like someone was following her. Emma had mentioned seeing the same person in different places, at the grocery store, at the gas station, even outside the school. She'd described the person as keeping their distance, but always watching. Emma was scared, Janet finally admitted to police. She didn't want to worry David or her family, but she was really scared. She said she felt like she was being hunted. These revelations painted a picture of a young woman who had been living in fear in the weeks before her wedding, too concerned about ruining her special day to share her terror with the people who loved her most. The perfect wedding that everyone remembered was now revealed to be a facade, hiding a darkness that had been growing for weeks. 3 weeks after Emma's disappearance, when hope was beginning to fade and the daily searches had dwindled to a handful of dedicated volunteers, a discovery was made that would rekindle the investigation while simultaneously deepening the mystery. Tommy Peterson, a 12-year-old boy who lived on the outskirts of Millbrook, was exploring the woods behind his house when he spotted something white caught in the branches of a creek about half a mile from the community center. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was Emma's veil, the delicate handmade veil that Carol Richardson had spent months creating, now torn and stained, hanging from a branch like a ghost in the morning light. The piece of fabric that had made Emma look like an angel was now evidence of something terrible. The police response was immediate and intense. The area around the creek was cordoned off, and search teams combed through every inch of the surrounding woods. The veil had been caught about 8 feet up in the branches, suggesting it had been carried by rushing water during a storm that had occurred 5 days after Emma's disappearance. What made the discovery even more significant was what forensic analysis revealed. The veil showed signs of having been forcibly removed. There were tears in the fabric that indicated it had been grabbed or pulled, but there were no signs of blood, no DNA evidence beyond Emma's own. It was as if the veil had been a breadcrumb left behind to taunt investigators. The discovery led to an intensive search of the creek and its tributaries. Divers from the state police searched every deep pool and underwater obstruction. Search dogs followed the waterway for miles, looking for any trace of Emma or her clothing. The search lasted for days, with volunteers and professionals working around the clock. But the creek yielded no more secrets. No body, no additional clothing, no signs of struggle, just that single haunting piece of fabric that had somehow survived weeks in the wilderness while Emma had vanished completely. The veil discovery also brought unwanted attention to the case. Regional media picked up the story, and Millbrook found itself invaded by reporters and true crime enthusiasts. The small town, already reeling from the disappearance of one of its most beloved residents, now had to cope with strangers asking intrusive questions and cameras documenting their grief. For the Richardson family, the veil represented both hope and horror. Hope, because it was the first concrete evidence that Emma had been in those woods, that she hadn't simply chosen to disappear. Horror, because the condition of the veil and the way it had been removed suggested that Emma had been taken against her will. David Martinez was brought in for additional questioning after the veil was found. Police wanted to know if he had ever been to that particular area of the woods, if he had any connection to the creek where it was discovered. His answers were consistent with his previous statements, but the pressure was taking its toll. The man who had been planning to start his married life was now the primary suspect in his bride's disappearance. The forensic analysis of the veil revealed other disturbing details. Microscopic examination showed that it had been exposed to motor oil and gasoline, suggesting that Emma had been near a vehicle when it was removed. There were also traces of an industrial cleaning solution, the kind used in auto shops and garages. These findings pointed investigators in a new direction. They began looking at everyone in Millbrook who had access to automotive facilities, who might have reason to use industrial cleaning products. The list was surprisingly long in a small town where many residents worked in trades or owned small businesses. But the veil raised more questions than it answered. If Emma had been taken from the community center to the woods, why was only her veil found? Where was the rest of her clothing? Where was Emma herself? The discovery that should have brought closure instead opened new avenues of investigation and deepened the mystery that was consuming Millbrook. Time has a way of dulling even the sharpest pain, but for the Richardson family, the passage of months without answers only made their agony more unbearable. By winter of 2009, the daily searches had stopped. The media had moved on to other stories. The volunteers had returned to their normal lives. But Emma was still missing, and her family was still trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The investigation had reached a standstill. Police had interviewed hundreds of people, followed dozens of leads, and analyzed every piece of evidence they could find. They had questioned David Martinez repeatedly, polygraphed him twice, and searched his home and workplace multiple times. They had investigated Jake Morrison, tracked down every owner of a dark pickup truck in the county, and followed up on dozens of tips from well-meaning citizens. But none of it had led to Emma. Carol Richardson had aged years in the months since her daughter's disappearance. The woman who had once been known for her warm smile and easy laugh now moved through the world like a ghost. She had turned Emma's childhood bedroom into a shrine, keeping everything exactly as it had been, as if her daughter might walk through the door at any moment. She couldn't work, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't function in any normal way. Robert had to take over all the household responsibilities, while also dealing with his own grief and the financial strain of the ongoing investigation. They had hired a private investigator, exhausting their savings in the process. But even he had eventually admitted that the trail had gone cold. Michael Richardson returned to college, but his grades suffered. He couldn't concentrate, couldn't engage with his studies or his friends. He felt guilty for having a life when Emma couldn't, guilty for moments when he forgot about her disappearance and felt normal, guilty for being alive when she might not be. David Martinez was a broken man. The community's suspicion had cost him his job at the garage. His father, trying to protect the family business, had suggested that David might want to work elsewhere until the situation was resolved. David had understood. But the rejection from the family that had once embraced him as a son was devastating. He had moved into a small apartment on the other side of town, trying to escape the constant stares and whispered conversations. He couldn't bring himself to remove his wedding ring, couldn't accept that Emma was gone, couldn't move forward with his life while she was still missing. The town itself had changed. The easy trust that had once characterized Millbrook was gone. Parents walked their children to school. Women avoided being alone after dark. The sense of security that comes from living in a small town where everyone knows everyone had been shattered by the realization that evil could hide behind familiar faces. Chief Williams retired early, unable to cope with the failure to solve the case that had defined her final years in law enforcement. Her replacement, Chief Martinez, no relation to David, inherited a department that was demoralized and a community that had lost faith in law enforcement's ability to protect them. The case file grew dusty. New crimes demanded attention. The search for Emma Richardson became a cold case, revisited occasionally when new leads emerged, but never with the urgency and resources that had characterized the initial investigation. But the Richardson family never gave up. They organized annual memorial walks, kept Emma's story in the local newspaper, and continued to hope that someone, somewhere, would come forward with the information that would finally bring their daughter home. They had no way of knowing that the answers they sought were hidden in plain sight, waiting in the shadows of a place they had never thought to look. 14 years. 14 years of anniversaries marked by tears instead of celebration. 14 years of hoping every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock at the door. 14 years of watching David Martinez grow from a heartbroken young man into a hollow-eyed stranger. 14 years of watching Carol Richardson fade away piece by piece, consumed by grief and unanswered questions. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March 2023. Carol was in Emma's room, as she often was, sitting in the rocking chair where she used to read bedtime stories to her daughter. The phone rang, and she almost didn't answer. Too many calls over the years had brought false hope and fresh heartbreak. But something made her pick up. Maybe it was the way the spring light was filtering through Emma's curtains, or maybe it was the dream she'd had the night before. Emma calling to her from somewhere far away, saying she was ready to come home. "Mrs. Richardson, this is Detective Sarah Chen from the State Police. I'm calling about your daughter's case." Carol's hand gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles went white. After all these years, she knew better than to get excited. There had been dozens of calls like this. Sightings that turned out to be other people, tips that led nowhere, new investigators who wanted to review the case with fresh eyes. "We've received some information that I think you'll want to hear," Detective Chen continued. "Can you and your husband come to the station this afternoon?" The drive to the state police station felt like the longest hour of Carol's life. She and Robert sat in silence, both afraid to hope, both unable to stop themselves from wondering if this might finally be the day they learned what had happened to their daughter. Detective Chen was younger than Carol had expected, probably close to Emma's age if Emma had lived. She had kind eyes and a gentle manner that immediately put the grieving parents at ease. She led them into a small conference room where case files were spread across a table like pieces of a puzzle that had never been solved. 3 days ago, we received a call from a woman named Martha Hendricks, Detective Chen began. She owns a farm about 15 miles outside of Millbrook. She's been battling cancer, and she's decided she needs to clear her conscience before she dies. Carol felt her heart stop. After all these years, after all the dead ends and false leads, was this finally the moment they'd been waiting for? Mrs. Hendricks called because she had information about a property that belonged to her deceased brother, Edgar Hendricks. Edgar died 8 years ago, and the property has been sitting empty ever since. Martha has been trying to sell it, and she hired some people to clean out the old barn so she could tear it down. Detective Chen paused, studying the faces of the parents who had been waiting for this moment for 14 years. Yesterday, the cleanup crew found something in the barn's attic, something that Martha's brother had hidden there, something that she says she always wondered about but was too afraid to investigate. The detective reached across the table and pulled out a plastic evidence bag. Inside, carefully preserved, was a piece of white fabric, aged, yellowed, but unmistakably familiar. "We believe this is your daughter's wedding dress." Carol's scream pierced the air like a wounded animal. 14 years of suppressed grief and desperate hope came pouring out in that single, agonized sound. Robert reached for his wife, his own tears falling freely as he stared at the dress that had made their daughter look like an angel on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The dress was intact, but showed signs of having been hidden hastily. There were stains that would need analysis, tears that might tell a story, and most importantly, the dress had been found in a location that had never been searched, on property owned by a man who had died with his secrets. Detective Chen gave them time to process, to cry, to hold each other as they faced the reality that their daughter's disappearance was no longer a mystery, but a homicide. "We're reopening the case," she said softly, "and this time we know where to look." The investigation into Edgar Hendricks revealed a man who had lived his entire life in the shadows, harboring secrets that had died with him 8 years earlier. But the dead can't keep secrets forever, and the barn that had hidden Emma's wedding dress for 14 years was about to give up the truth that had been buried with Edgar. Edgar Hendricks had been a loner, a man in his 50s who had worked as a handyman around Millbrook for decades. He was the kind of person who was everywhere and nowhere, fixing leaky faucets and broken fences, welcomed into people's homes because he was skilled with his hands and worked cheap. He had access to dozens of properties, knew everyone's schedules, and had a key to half the buildings in town. What the police discovered was that Edgar had been obsessed with Emma Richardson for years. His sister Martha, now dying of cancer and finally ready to speak the truth, revealed that Edgar's room in the farmhouse had been covered with photos of Emma. Pictures taken from a distance, newspaper clippings from her college graduation, even photos of her with David that had been taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. He used to talk about her like she was his girlfriend, Martha told Detective Chen, her voice hoarse from chemotherapy. He'd say things like, "Emma's going to realize we're meant to be together," or, "Once she sees that David isn't right for her, she'll come to me." I thought it was just harmless fantasy, but now, the search of the barn revealed evidence that Edgar had been planning Emma's abduction for months. In addition to the wedding dress, investigators found a makeshift room in the barn's loft, complete with a bed, food supplies, and restraints. It was clear that Edgar had intended to keep Emma alive, to convince her somehow that they belonged together. The forensic evidence painted a horrifying picture of Emma's final hours. Analysis of the wedding dress showed that she had been chloroformed, explaining why there had been no screams, no struggle that anyone at the wedding had witnessed. Edgar had waited until she stepped outside, then approached her with a cloth soaked in the chemical, rendering her unconscious before anyone could intervene. The dress also revealed traces of Emma's blood, but the pattern suggested that she had fought back once she regained consciousness. There were defensive wounds, indicated by the blood spatter, tears in the fabric that showed she had struggled desperately to escape her captor. What became clear from the evidence was that Edgar's fantasy of romance had quickly turned to rage when Emma rejected his advances. The room in the barn showed signs of a violent struggle, overturned furniture, blood on the walls, and ultimately the tragedy that Edgar had never intended but had been unable to prevent once his delusions crumbled. Martha Hendricks led police to a section of the farm where Edgar had always forbidden her to go. Using ground-penetrating radar, they found what they had been looking for. Emma Richardson's remains were buried in a shallow grave behind the barn, hidden beneath a compost pile that Edgar had maintained for years. The autopsy revealed that Emma had died from blunt force trauma to the head, likely during her struggle to escape. She had fought until the very end, her fingernails containing DNA evidence that would have solved the case years earlier if Edgar had ever been considered a suspect. But Edgar Hendricks had been invisible, the helpful handyman who had fixed the Richardson family's front door the week before the wedding, who had been trusted with keys to the community center, who had been welcomed into Emma's school to repair broken windows. He had been hiding in plain sight, his obsession growing unchecked until it exploded into violence on what should have been the most beautiful night of Emma's life. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Edgar had been the source of the mysterious phone calls, the dark pickup truck outside Emma's apartment, and the break-in at her classroom. He had been stalking her for months, studying her routines, planning the perfect moment to take her. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both a relief and a horror. The Richardson family finally had answers, but those answers revealed a nightmare that had been living among them for years, trusted and unsuspected, until it was too late to save Emma. But the discovery of Emma's remains and the revelation of Edgar Hendricks' obsession was not the end of the story. As Detective Chen dug deeper into the evidence, a far more disturbing truth began to emerge, one that would shake the very foundations of Millbrook and forever change how the Richardson family viewed their daughter's death. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analyzing Edgar's personal effects, investigators found a diary hidden in his bedroom wall. The entries, dating back 5 years before Emma's disappearance, revealed not just his obsession with Emma, but detailed descriptions of his movements, his planning, and most shocking of all, his communications with someone else. Edgar Hendricks had not acted alone. The diary entries revealed that Edgar had been receiving encouragement and assistance from someone who knew Emma's schedule, someone who had access to information about the wedding planning, someone who had helped him understand when Emma would be most vulnerable. The diary referred to this person only as M and described regular meetings where they would discuss Emma's habits and routines. M understands, one entry read. M knows that Emma needs to be saved from David. Emma sees what I see, that Emma is meant for better things. Shim will help when the time is right. Detective Chen's investigation into who M might be led to a shocking discovery. Phone records from Edgar's landline revealed regular calls to a number that belonged to Michael Richardson, Emma's younger brother. The initial reaction was disbelief. Michael had been devastated by Emma's disappearance, had dedicated his life to searching for her, had never given up hope that she would return. The idea that he could have been involved in her abduction seemed impossible, but as Detective Chen investigated further, a darker picture of Michael Richardson began to emerge. College records showed that he had been struggling academically and socially, that he had been seeing a therapist for depression and obsessive thoughts about his sister. The therapist's notes, obtained through a court order, revealed that Michael had expressed inappropriate feelings toward Emma, feelings that had been growing stronger as her wedding approached. He was jealous, the therapist had written, not just of David, but of anyone who took Emma's attention away from him. He spoke about Emma in ways that were concerning, as if she belonged to him rather than being his sister. He was particularly agitated about the wedding, saying that Emma was making a mistake and that someone needed to stop her. The most damning evidence came from Michael's laptop, which had been stored in his childhood bedroom for years. Forensic analysis revealed that he had been researching methods of abduction, had been visiting forums dedicated to kidnapping scenarios, and had been in regular contact with Edgar Hendricks through encrypted messaging apps. The messages between Michael and Edgar revealed a conspiracy that had been years in the making. Michael had provided Edgar with Emma's schedule, had told him about her fears of being followed, had even suggested that Edgar approach her on the wedding night when she would be isolated and vulnerable. "She trusts me," one message from Michael read. "She won't see it coming if you approach her while she's outside. I'll make sure David is distracted." B. The final piece of the puzzle came from security footage from the community center that had been stored but never carefully analyzed. Enhanced video showed Michael leaving the reception shortly before Emma's disappearance, returning 20 minutes later with dirt on his shoes and a strange, satisfied expression on his face. But the most chilling discovery was Michael's real motive. The messages revealed that he had never intended for Emma to be hurt. He had believed that Edgar would simply take her away, that the failed kidnapping would make her realize how much she needed her family, how much she needed him. He had convinced himself that he was saving Emma from a marriage that he believed was wrong for her. When Edgar's obsession had turned violent, when Emma had fought back and been killed, Michael had been devastated. But he had also been trapped by his own complicity. He couldn't report Edgar's crime without exposing his own involvement, so he had spent 14 years living with the guilt of knowing that his actions had led to his sister's death. The arrest of Michael Richardson sent shockwaves through Millbrook and destroyed what remained of the Richardson family. Carol and Robert, who had already lost their daughter, now faced the unthinkable reality that their son had been responsible for her death. The courtroom was packed the day Michael Richardson was sentenced. 14 years after Emma's disappearance, the small town of Millbrook had finally learned the truth about what had happened to their beloved teacher, their missing daughter, their vanished bride. But the truth was more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Michael Richardson, now 33 years old, sat in the defendant's chair looking like a broken man. The young college student who had searched desperately for his sister, who had organized memorial services and kept her memory alive, was revealed to be the architect of her destruction. His tears were real, his remorse genuine, but nothing could change the fact that his jealousy and obsession had led to Emma's death. Carol Richardson sat in the front row, her face a mask of grief and betrayal. She had lost her daughter 14 years ago, and now she was losing her son. The family that had once been so close, so loving, so perfect, had been destroyed by secrets and lies that had festered in the darkness for years. "I never meant for her to be hurt," Michael said during his statement to the court. I thought I was protecting her. I thought Edgar would just take her away for a while, and then she'd come back to us. I never imagined he would hurt her. I never wanted Emma to die. But intentions don't bring back the dead. They don't heal the wounds that have festered for 14 years. They don't restore the trust that was shattered when a family discovered that evil had been living among them, wearing the face of love. David Martinez, now 37 and remarried with children he never talks about, attended the sentencing. He sat alone in the back of the courtroom, the man who had been wrongly suspected for over a decade, finally vindicated but forever changed. The life he should have had with Emma was gone, and the years of suspicion and isolation had left scars that would never heal. The impact on Millbrook was profound. The town that had rallied around the Richardson family, that had searched for Emma for weeks, that had kept her memory alive for 14 years, now had to confront the reality that the truth had been hiding in their midst all along. Neighbors looked at each other differently. Parents held their children closer. The innocence that small towns cherish was gone forever. Chief Martinez, who had inherited the cold case, spoke at a press conference after the sentencing. "This case has taught us that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Sometimes it wears a familiar face. Sometimes it hides behind love and family bonds. Sometimes the person we trust most is the person we should fear." The elementary school where Emma had taught established a memorial garden in her honor. Her former students, now adults with children of their own, contributed to a scholarship fund for teachers who showed Emma's dedication to making every child feel valued and loved. The community center where she disappeared was renovated, and a plaque was installed in her memory. But perhaps the most profound impact was on our understanding of how well we really know the people we love. Emma Richardson had died because someone who claimed to love her had confused possession with protection, obsession with devotion. Her brother had believed that his feelings for her were normal, that his jealousy was justified, that his actions were motivated by love. The case forced everyone who heard it to examine their own relationships, their own assumptions about family and love and trust. How many other families harbor secrets that could explode into violence? How many other Michael Richardsons are walking among us, their obsessions hidden behind smiles and concern? Emma's story became a cautionary tale about the danger of idealized relationships, about the thin line between love and possession, about the way trauma and mental illness can twist normal emotions into something dark and destructive. The wedding dress sits in an evidence locker now, tagged and catalogued, no longer the symbol of hope and new beginnings it was meant to be. The delicate lace that Carol Richardson had spent months restoring, the fabric that had been passed down through generations of women in love, had become the key to solving a murder that had haunted a town for 14 years. Emma Richardson would have been 37 years old now. She might have had children, might have been teaching a new generation of kindergartners, might have been growing old with David in the house they'd planned to buy. Instead, she remains forever 23, forever a bride, forever the girl who disappeared on what should have been the happiest night of her life. The barn where her dress was hidden has been torn down. Martha Hendricks sold the property to developers who built a small subdivision of modest homes. Young families live there now, Children play in yards where Emma's killer once walked, and life continues in the way that life always does, building new dreams on the foundations of old tragedies. David Martinez keeps a single photo of Emma on his desk at the insurance office where he now works. His wife understands, his children know the story, and he's found a way to honor Emma's memory while still living his life. He visits her grave every year on what would have been their wedding anniversary, leaving wildflowers like the ones he proposed with so many years ago. Carol Richardson never recovered from the double loss of both her children. She died 3 years after Michael's sentencing, her body finally succumbing to a grief that had been eating away at her soul for 17 years. Robert scattered her ashes next to Emma's grave, finally reuniting mother and daughter in death since they couldn't be reunited in life. Michael Richardson is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. He spends his days writing letters to his sister, letters that will never be delivered, apologizing for things that can never be forgiven. His cell walls are covered with photos of Emma, the same obsession that led to her death, now the only thing that gives his life meaning. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Emma's story is how normal it all seemed from the outside. A loving family, a perfect wedding, a bright future ahead. The darkness was hiding in plain sight, disguised as brotherly love and family bonds. The evil that destroyed Emma Richardson didn't come from a stranger in the shadows. It came from someone who had shared her childhood, her home, her parents' love. The case files are closed now, but the questions linger. How many other families are harboring secrets that could explode into violence? How many other loved ones are actually predators in disguise? How many other Emma Richardsons are walking toward their own destruction, trusting the people who mean them harm? Emma's story reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears the face of someone we love, someone we trust, someone we would never suspect. Sometimes the person who claims to want to protect us is actually the person we need protection from. The white dress that started this story as a symbol of love and hope became evidence of betrayal and murder. But in the end, it also became the key to justice, the final gift that Emma was able to give to her family and her community, the truth. She never made it to her honeymoon. She never got to have the children she dreamed of. She never got to grow old with the man she loved. But Emma Richardson did get something that many victims of violence never receive. She got her story told, her truth revealed, and her killer held accountable. In a world where so many disappearances remain unsolved, where so many families never get answers, Emma's case reminds us that sometimes, even after 14 years, justice is still possible. Sometimes the truth does emerge from the darkness. Sometimes the dress hidden in the attic does lead us home. But it also reminds us that the cost of that truth can be higher than anyone ever imagined.